The moment the guards stepped back and the rules quietly disappeared, something far more unsettling took their place. These German prisoners were no longer ordered, no longer watched, and no longer threatened. Yet instead of relief, confusion spread through the camp. Freedom arrived without celebration, without instructions, and without a single voice explaining what came next, leaving men who had survived captivity suddenly unsure how to exist without it. When the change finally happened, it did not announce itself with orders or ceremony, and it certainly did not arrive as a moment anyone had prepared for. There was no roll call that morning, no shouted commands cutting through the damp air, and no familiar rhythm forcing the men from their bunks. Instead, the camp simply felt different in a way that was difficult to name, as if something essential had been quietly removed during the night. The fences still stood, stretching across the muddy ground with the same cold indifference they always had, yet the presence behind them had shifted. Guards were fewer, their movements slower, their attention drifting elsewhere, and the routines that once defined every hour of the day no longer arrived on time. Meals were late, work details were delayed, and inspections that once felt inevitable failed to come at all. At first, the prisoners reacted as they always had, moving through the morning by habit rather than instruction. Boots were pulled on, coats buttoned, and beds folded with the same precision learned months earlier, not because anyone demanded it, but because their bodies remembered a structure their minds no longer fully questioned. Even without orders, they formed lines, gathered in familiar places, and waited for something to happen, convinced that the absence of commands was itself some kind of test. But as the hours passed, nothing corrected them. No punishment followed their hesitation, and no authority stepped in to restore the old rhythm. The silence lingered, heavy and unsettling, forcing each man to confront a truth that felt more dangerous than captivity itself. The system that had controlled their lives was loosening, not through kindness or mercy, but through neglect and indifference. Freedom, when it came, did not feel like release. It felt like standing on uncertain ground without markers, without boundaries, and without reassurance that the next step would be safe. Many of the men found themselves frozen, unsure whether acting on their own would bring consequences they could not yet see. Years of conditioning had taught them that initiative was dangerous, and now that initiative was suddenly expected without explanation. Some began to notice small details that confirmed the shift was real. Gates that once remained locked throughout the day were left ajar for hours at a time. Watchtowers stood empty longer than they should have, their windows dark against the gray sky. Even the guards who remained no longer carried themselves with the same authority, their presence feeling more symbolic than controlling. Yet no one rushed forward. No one celebrated. No one ran. Instead, the camp entered a strange state of suspension, where freedom existed in theory but felt unreachable in practice. The men had survived strict rules, hunger, and confinement, but they had never been taught how to live without someone else deciding what came next. In that uncertainty, a quiet fear began to grow, not of punishment or violence, but of choice itself. Each prisoner understood, often without speaking it aloud, that the moment they acted freely, they would be responsible for whatever followed. And for men whose lives had been governed by external control for so long, responsibility felt heavier than captivity ever had. By the end of that first day, it was clear that something irreversible had begun. The camp had not opened its gates in celebration, but it had removed the invisible walls that once told men who they were and how they were supposed to behave. And in that absence, many realized that freedom, when offered without guidance, could be far more terrifying than chains. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days passed, the men slowly began to understand that the silence was not temporary. The absence of commands did not correct itself, and the routines that once returned with mechanical certainty failed to reappear. Morning came and went without signals, and evenings settled in without inspections, leaving long stretches of time unclaimed by authority. At first, many prisoners continued to behave as if nothing had truly changed. They lined up at the same hours, gathered near familiar buildings, and waited in quiet groups, convinced that discipline still existed somewhere, just out of sight. They believed that any moment a whistle would sound or a voice would cut through the air, restoring the order that had shaped their lives for years. But the longer nothing happened, the harder it became to maintain the illusion. Some men drifted away from the lines, returning to their bunks or wandering aimlessly across the yard, unsure what they were supposed to do with hours that now belonged to no one. Others remained standing in place, refusing to move, as though action without instruction might trigger punishment delayed rather than canceled. Conversations began to change. Instead of whispered complaints or shared rumors about the outside world, the men spoke about rules they could no longer see. They debated whether freedom had truly arrived or whether it was simply another form of control designed to expose weakness. Many believed that the lack of enforcement was intentional, a trap meant to reveal who could be trusted and who could not. This uncertainty fractured the camp in subtle ways. Some prisoners started making small decisions for themselves, choosing when to eat, when to rest, and where to walk, while others watched them with quiet suspicion. Freedom, instead of uniting them, created invisible divisions between those willing to act and those paralyzed by caution. The guards noticed these changes, but did little to intervene. Their presence remained distant, their authority faded, and their reactions unpredictable. Sometimes they observed silently. Other times they turned away entirely, reinforcing the unsettling truth that the structure governing the camp no longer functioned as it once had. As days blended together, a deeper fear took root, one that went beyond uncertainty. The men began to realize that waiting for orders was itself a choice, and that every hour spent standing still was time they would never reclaim. Yet stepping forward meant acknowledging that the responsibility for their actions now rested solely on them. This realization weighed heavily on those who had survived by following rules rather than questioning them. Obedience had once been a shield, a way to endure hardship without attracting attention, but now obedience offered no protection. The system they had relied upon to define right and wrong had vanished, leaving them exposed to consequences they could no longer predict. By the end of the second week, it became clear that the most difficult adjustment was not physical freedom, but mental release. The men were no longer prisoners in the traditional sense, yet they remained confined by habits, fears, and expectations formed under years of control. And as long as they continued waiting for instructions that never came, freedom remained something distant, undefined, and deeply unsettling. As the absence of authority stretched on, the camp entered a quieter, heavier phase. What once felt like uncertainty slowly transformed into something more exhausting. The silence no longer surprised anyone, but it began to press down on the men in ways they could not easily explain. Without schedules to divide the day, time expanded unnaturally. Hours felt longer, yet they passed without leaving clear memories behind. Many prisoners struggled to recall how they had spent entire afternoons, as if their minds rejected moments that lacked purpose or direction. The lack of structure made even simple actions feel weightless and strangely meaningless. Some men attempted to fill the emptiness by recreating fragments of the old routine. They woke at the same hour, cleaned their clothing with unnecessary precision, and repeated familiar tasks that served no practical function. These habits offered brief comfort, not because they were required, but because they reminded the men of a world where expectations still existed. Others responded differently. They stopped participating altogether, remaining in their bunks for extended periods or sitting alone in corners of the yard, staring without focus. Their bodies remained present, but their attention drifted inward, consumed by thoughts they had once suppressed through obedience and repetition. Freedom had removed distractions, and with them, the ability to escape memory. The camp itself reflected this change. Spaces that once buzzed with enforced activity now felt abandoned, not because they were empty, but because no one seemed to belong anywhere anymore. Men crossed paths without acknowledgement, each absorbed in his own private struggle to understand what was expected of him now that nothing was demanded. Whispers of unease spread quietly. Some prisoners began to fear that the silence was eroding something essential inside them. Without rules to resist, without orders to resent, they found themselves confronting questions they had avoided throughout captivity. Who were they without commands to follow? And what remained once obedience was no longer required. A few men tried to assert control by imposing expectations on others, suggesting informal rules or shared responsibilities. But these efforts often collapsed quickly. Without authority to support them, such structures felt fragile, easily ignored, and sometimes resented. Attempts at leadership revealed how deeply the camp relied on enforced hierarchy rather than mutual agreement. The most troubling realization came slowly, almost unnoticed. The men discovered that fear no longer came from punishment or violence, but from choice itself. Every decision carried weight because there was no longer a system to absorb blame. Inaction became just as frightening as action, and responsibility lingered in the air like an unspoken threat. By this stage, the camp was no longer defined by fences or guards, but by an internal tension shared by those inside it. The men were free to move, yet hesitant to act. They were no longer controlled, yet unable to feel autonomous. And as silence continued to dominate their days, it became clear that the absence of force had introduced a new kind of confinement, one built entirely within their own minds. As the weight of unstructured days continued to press down on the camp, some of the men began to sense that the absence of order was becoming more difficult to endure than captivity itself. The freedom they had waited for no longer felt like an opportunity, but like an open space too wide to navigate, and slowly, almost instinctively, the need for structure began to resurface. It did not return through commands or declarations, but through suggestion and imitation. A few prisoners started waking earlier than others, gathering in familiar areas of the yard and repeating small routines that had once been mandatory. They did not announce these actions as rules, yet their consistency gave them weight, and before long, others began to follow, drawn not by authority, but by relief. The camp responded quietly to these patterns. Men who joined the informal routines felt less exposed, less burdened by choice, while those who did not found themselves standing apart, uncertain where they belonged. No one forced participation, but participation offered a sense of belonging that the silence had slowly eroded. The pressure to conform emerged not through threat, but through contrast. Small expectations took shape. Voices lowered at certain times of day. Movement slowed in shared spaces. Certain paths across the yard became preferred, while others were subtly avoided. These behaviors were never discussed openly, yet deviation drew attention in the form of lingering glances or sudden pauses in conversation. Correction occurred without confrontation, and most men adjusted without resistance. What made this new order effective was its subtlety. Because it appeared voluntary, it felt reasonable. Because it reduced uncertainty, it felt necessary. The men told themselves that structure was practical, that routine was healthy, and that cooperation prevented chaos. Few recognized that they were rebuilding the very system they had once resented, not because they were forced to, but because disorder demanded too much from them. Attempts to resist this emerging order were rare and brief. Those who tried to act independently often retreated quickly, unsettled by the quiet isolation that followed. Acting outside the shared rhythm meant standing alone with one's decisions. And after months or years of enforced obedience, solitude felt more threatening than conformity. The group did not punish deviation, but it did not accommodate it either. Gradually, the camp settled into a new balance. Days regained shape, conversations regained predictability, and uncertainty retreated just enough to make life feel manageable again. The men no longer spoke about freedom or escape, not because those ideas were forbidden, but because they felt irrelevant to the immediate task of maintaining stability. By the time this phase fully took hold, the camp no longer required guards to function. Order had returned in a quieter form, built from shared anxiety and sustained by mutual observation. Authority had dissolved, but obedience remained, carried forward by the collective desire to avoid the psychological strain of unstructured existence. And in this reconstructed calm, many men realized, without fully admitting it to themselves, that they had not simply adapted to freedom. They had replaced it with something that felt safer, something familiar, and something that asked far less of them than true independence ever could. As the informal order within the camp settled into place, the men began to experience a strange sense of relief, not because their situation had improved in any material way, but because uncertainty no longer dominated every moment of the day. The routines they had reconstructed, though limited and unspoken, offered something deeply comforting after weeks of mental strain, and that comfort slowly reshaped how freedom itself was perceived. Days now unfolded with a recognizable rhythm. Men rose at similar hours, gathered in familiar spaces, and occupied themselves with small, repetitive tasks that carried no real purpose beyond filling time and maintaining stability. These actions required little thought, and in requiring little thought, they reduced the burden of choice that had weighed so heavily on everyone since authority had faded. The idea of leaving the camp, once discussed in whispers and cautious glances, gradually lost its urgency. Freedom outside the fences no longer appeared as a clear alternative, but as an undefined expanse filled with responsibility, uncertainty, and isolation. Inside the camp, life was narrow but predictable. Outside, it was wide but unstructured. For men whose identities have been shaped by years of obedience and survival, predictability felt safer than possibility. Some prisoners still approached the boundaries from time to time, standing near open areas or in used gates, observing the space beyond without stepping into it. These moments rarely lasted long. The farther they imagined themselves from the familiar routines, the more exposed they felt, as though leaving would strip away the fragile sense of balance they had finally regained. Staying required no justification. The longer the men remained within the reconstructed order, the more natural it felt. Each day of conformity reinforced the next, until the system no longer felt temporary or improvised. It became simply the way things were done. The camp had ceased to feel like a place waiting to be left, and instead became a place that quietly absorbed those within it. What made this transformation especially powerful was that it involved no force. No one was compelled to stay. No threats were issued. No punishment followed hesitation. Yet the collective fear of disorder, combined with the comfort of routine, proved more effective than any guard or fence. Freedom demanded courage, clarity, and responsibility, while staying demanded nothing at all. By this stage, many of the men no longer thought of themselves as prisoners, but neither did they think of themselves as free. They existed in a state between the two, where movement was possible but undesirable, and where choice felt less like empowerment and more like danger. In choosing stability over uncertainty, they had not rejected freedom outright. They had simply postponed it indefinitely, convincing themselves that waiting was wiser than acting, and that remaining within familiar boundaries was not surrender, but survival. And so the camp endured, not as a place of enforced captivity, but as a refuge from the demands of freedom itself, holding men who were no longer restrained by chains, yet no longer ready to walk away. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the moment when freedom lost its appeal because there was no clear decision to reject it and no single instant that could be pointed to as a turning point. Instead, freedom simply asked more than the men felt capable of giving, demanding initiative, responsibility, and uncertainty at a time when routine and predictability had become the only sources of stability they trusted. The camp no longer needed fences or guards to hold them in place, because the structure they had rebuilt together provided everything captivity once had, minus the violence and the fear. Days were manageable, expectations were clear, and life continued without forcing anyone to confront questions they were not ready to answer. In comparison, the outside world felt distant, undefined, and heavy with consequence. No one celebrated staying, and no one openly refused to leave. The choice dissolved quietly into habit, reinforced by comfort and repeated by hesitation, until remaining inside the familiar boundaries felt natural rather than imposed. Freedom had arrived without guidance, and in the absence of guidance, it became something to be delayed rather than embraced. What lingered was not regret, but acceptance, shaped by the belief that survival did not always mean moving forward, and that sometimes the safest response to uncertainty was to remain where life felt understandable. The men did not stay because they were weak, but because the structure they had known, however limited, offered relief from a freedom that demanded too much all at once. And so the camp continued, not as a place of punishment, but as a quiet shelter from choice itself, leaving behind an unsettling truth that freedom, when offered without preparation, can feel more frightening than captivity ever was. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.